So thank you, Bruce, for inviting me to share some thoughts about integral theory and the future of religion and spirituality. I'd like to start at the very beginning of integral theory. It was 25 years ago that Ken Wilber published Sex, Ecology, and Spirituality. And at the very beginning of that text, which I don't think the integral community has taken full note of, he evokes the question of the great 19th century philosopher Schelling, who asked in a new frame, why is there something rather than nothing? And then Wilber goes on to talk about the kinds of answers. Some are, well, it's just kind of arbitrary, and much of the modern world doesn't really have an answer. And he playfully calls this the philosophy of oops. And he says this philosophy of oops, which sort of underwrites a lot of how we live, think, and do, is actually immature. It lacks what Kant called a kind of Mündigkeit, a maturity. And that we can come up with a better answer to that. And I want to take a breath and just pause and talk about what Wilber's actually doing here, and what integral theory, in a sense, is an ongoing answer to. Schelling's question, it had been asked earlier by Leibniz, but Schelling is asking it in the wake of the philosopher Kant. So his way of asking and his way of answering needs to be, let's call it post-metaphysical or minimally metaphysical. It needs to involve some kind of transcendental argument. It just can't be a sheer assertion of, God is this and so on. It has to have some kind of method of answering that question. And why ask that question? Well, Wilber seems to 25 years ago have understood this. And it's more recent Schelling scholarship that has come up with the understanding that what Schelling is asking is an existential question in the modern world. Why do things matter to humans? That's really that's sort of how the nexus of underlying questions and concerns would animate this question. Why is there something rather than nothing? And since we're part of the something, what are we participating in? What are the patterns? What are the meanings, if any, that we're a part of as human beings, embedded in? So it's fundamentally a kind of existential question that is pointing to what might be ultimate, what Paul Tillich, who was an existential theologian, a brilliant one, called ultimate concern. And it does so in a way that contrasts, for example, a similar kind of questioning of the 20th century philosopher Heidegger, who I admire tremendously as a philosopher. In his main text, Being and Time, Heidegger, who was very aware of Schelling, did some lectures on Schelling, said, what is the meaning of being? And so the question is close, and Heidegger's question shift, what's the truth of being, what's the meaning of being? And of course, he was aware of Schelling and Leibniz's question. And the way he answers it is quite different. I mean, he says, well, we're in the knot of language, predication. Anything we say about being has the verb is in it. So we can't approach this directly. And so let's approach it by exploring that being for which being is at stake, the human being. And so from the meaning of being, we move into a brilliant analysis of what it means to be in the world, a brilliant new kind of phenomenology of human existence. So Wilber's evocation of Schelling, I want to suggest, is an existential question. It's not meant to be abstract. It's meant to be a deep sense of what really should or can concern us. And it does so not in a modern existential form that stresses the individual and the human, but rather stresses what are the patterns of manifestation themselves, and what degree how is human being situated in that, and might we extract a sense of meaning or significance from that patterning. Integral theory is an extended answer to that question. And I think Wilber's way of setting this up is actually not been fully appreciated in our community. and is actually quite brilliant. It's a really subtle philosophical move, because he's actually also working within the 20th century tradition of hermeneutics. He is making the question a kind of priority. Hermeneutic philosophers like Gadamer say that, our assertions largely are answers to unstated questions. And so it pays to move along the circle of understanding if we thematize and bring forward what our questions actually are. Now, we can never sort of start from a fresh beginning. We're always thrown into meanings, traditions, ways of seeing, and so on. But we can be more or less deep about engaging these kinds of questions that by thematizing the question of that seems to be really animating our kinds of inquiries. So Heidegger was, of course, involved in this, the meaning of being, but Wilber is saying what's prior is a question. This question motivates deep concerns. He's asking a big question, a great question, I would suggest, a very productive question, which has sub-questions and other kinds of extensions. And then integral theory is the answer. Because it matters. Because it's and this is about not asserting naked, just asserting grounds. And I'm going to want to talk a little about the issue of faith in a little bit and what that notion of faith is. This is not grounded in faith, a sheer taking up a tradition and reasserting a meaning, God is X or this is that. This is actually an engagement of inquiry. One might call it something like, echoing Socrates and Plato, the examined life. This is examined religion or spiritual life. That we actually ask these kind of deep questions and not fear the answers of them. So this is sort of how Wilber is setting up integral theory, and then his answer and his way of approaching it, I think, is equally interesting. It doesn't mean I'm convinced by all of it, or it's the only way of answering, but there's a method there as well. And that method is to look at everything in some general sense of patterns of human knowledge and see what degree they might actually point to fitting together into patterns of a kind. And then if they are patterns, can we speak those patterns? And Wilber's integral theory is to say the 20 tenets in sex ecology and spirituality are those underwriting patterns of all these different dimensions of the cosmos, whether it's mental, physical, whatever it is, whether it's biological. These 20 tenets, these underlying patterns, sort of inferential, are a form of transcendental argument. They're saying if the world is going to work this way, these things have to be in operation. It's a Kantian approach that, again, I don't think has been fully appreciated. Some of the tenets are descriptive. Some of the tenets are more like causes, and we may disagree, and I have my own disagreements with some of this. Even I would approach some of the questions in the answer to the question in a different way. But I just want to take a pause to see that the very opening of integral theory is grounded in a very sensitive, careful hermeneutics, asking an existential question at its depth. Why is there something rather than nothing? And the answer itself is methodologically rigorous and a form of transcendental argument. So, just reflecting on this has re-deepened my appreciation for those efforts that are now a quarter century old. Now, what does this tell us then? What's the value of this for the status of religion and spirituality today, descriptively, proscriptively? Wilber's answer in a later book, Integral Spirituality, he posits something called the conveyor belt. That religion and religious traditions are going to be how development is carried forward. I'm skeptical of this. I don't think we can prescribe what's going to happen to religious traditions. I have no idea what's going to happen to them. What I can say is that this approach of moving past what might be called loosely dogma, just repeating what the past has said in religious and spiritual senses, but engaging in some form of methodological inquiry, which can be shared with others, which means it's lost dogma, it's open to conversation in some way, which is very important for a discursive democracy of any kind, thinking of Habermas here, that the ideal, almost like a regulative ideal in Kant's sense, is something like this approach, that we ask deep questions, we offer deeper answers, and we're able to discuss these with other people. I would say that religion and spirituality, whatever they are best encouraged, invited into this form of inquiry. And I wouldn't presuppose that someone is not at a developmental level and can't do this. This is what Kant called a regulative idea. It pressures where we're at. It pulls us in a direction of a deepening sense of what really matters to us, what's really happening. Is there spirit? What are religious traditions up to, and so on. My own writings have been about how we can answer this question, that it's a kind of creative blend of transcendental argument, underlaboring for existing domains of knowledge, certain forms of phenomenological analysis, genealogical and historical reflection to clarify what shadows are disabling our inquiry, how power structures are involved, for example, how social ills may actually be infecting our inquiry into spiritual religious matters, to give an example. I don't think there's one way of working that constellation. I think it's an ongoing project, but it's more sincere, and it's also open to, and I mean this particularly in light of what's happening today, it's open to a deliberative, a discursive democracy of conversation. You can talk with each other about these things. You may have different views, but you can talk. The notion of faith as it has taken form in the modern period, and there's a literature on this, it's not quite what faith meant in the pre-modern world, has really become, don't ask me. This is my faith. It's private. Other people share it with me. I believe it. I trust. I don't need to question it. And therefore, you can't question me. That's the issue. You can't question me. And it can be very productive if you have people living Christian faith, as we're seeing in social justice movements today, that are really full of heart. That's effective. But the notion of faith is equally open to other kinds of assertions. And so some assertions we may like, some we may not, but it kind of thwarts any kind of communal inquiry that honors the pluralism of religious and spiritual beliefs that are an irreducible dimension of the contemporary world. This is what we really have to handle. So this kind of questioning and answering, I would say is what I would recommend be part of educational processes as an invitation, not a demand, an invitation for a deepening and moving us in the direction of not knowing where our religious and spiritual traditions are going to go, not having a predetermined sense, allowing the interactions back and forth between and amongst citizens to move it forward and let it organically happen in that way. And in the process, creating tolerance, mutual learning, again, as a regulative idea, as something that is pressuring how we live our religious and spiritual lives together. So that's how I would see the Wilberian approach, sort of in general adapted to education and as an invitation to spirituality and religion. That's where I think I would want to prescriptively move in that direction. So I'm going to offer some what some of the results of this kind of inquiry can look like. I can't reproduce the inquiry. I can't, in a short period of time, reproduce the methods that have been engaged in this by myself and others. So there is an issue of limit of time, but I can share certain results of this. And again, I want to use integral theory as an anchor. And I'm going to do so by evoking a book written some years ago, co-authored by Dustin Taperna and John Darrell Rue, Earth is Eden. And the book is a conversation between integral spirituality and a third wave of theosophical teachings, principally brought forward by Bruce Lyons, called the trans-Himalayan tradition, or sometimes the Shambhala school. And it's towards the end of the book, if I remember, that John brought something in that really disturbed my integral sensibility and now is very pregnant for me. And that is the idea that there are, it's a wild idea at first glance, that there are beings that are more evolved than humans in such a way that they actually, in some sense, encompass us. It's not quite like we're cells of their body, because that's too much of a third-person perspective, and I'll get to that. But that these beings, in some sense, permeate wide numbers of human beings, in some sense. And these beings are, for lack of a word, like logoi. If we think of Socrates, he had a daemon, right? He had a second-person relationship to a daemon that he thought was his guidance in some sense. Traditions speak of angels and devas and vast beings and so on. Well, the theosophical tradition and this third turning in the trans-Himalayan are really postulating, and of course we can investigate this to some extent in certain ways, that the cosmos is actually populated by these logoi, by these beings that don't entirely take on physical bodies, but have a series of subtle bodies and forms of intelligence and their own degree of evolution. And when I first heard this, I was really kind of taken back. And now, through inquiry and communal work and so on, my inclination, one cannot be dogmatic about this, is that there's something to this. Once we realize that philosophically we should not reduce the regions of being to the Cartesian frame of mind and matter. However important neural nets are, however important neural patterns are for so-called awakening, doesn't mean that consciousness doesn't exist or other regions of being do not exist. It's a matter of development and communal practice and being non-reductive. So if there really are regions beyond what we are ordinarily accustomed to without training or without luck, and we can access these, why should we think we're the only intelligent beings on these planes of being is really the kind of question. And actually the issue here does have something to do with a kind of anthropocentrism. We seem to want to, well, it might say, oh, there are spiritual realities or the realities that are sort of more than the physical and so on, but we tend to treat them in the first and third perspectives. What I want to suggest is that these logoi, for lack of a word, are actually best understood as second-person beings in our relation to us. And not just second-person beings, a very special case of second person. A case of the second person that I now call thou. Thou is an evolved version of the second person. It is not the first person plural, we. That's a meta subject. It's not an ordinary you, which is a shifter, that at one moment I'm you, and the next moment I'm an I, and so on. Thou is asymmetrical, following Levinas. Thou cannot reverse. I can't become these logoi. These logoi always exceed me in some way. They're not third person. They're not objects. They're quote unquote subjects of some kind. But they're subjects as vaster than me or otherwise than me, are in relation to me as a thou. And this thou-ness can take various forms. It's dynamic. It can be alienated, unconscious. It can be a communing. It can be devotional. And it can even have a merging, where we merge with these logoi in some sense. And what's the significance? What's the upshot of this? Well, the first is that the universe is filled with meaning, significance. It's singing a variety of songs beyond our ability to hear. Second, it decenters the human, either tacitly or explicitly, as being the high point of evolution. We're actually not that evolved. We're part of a much vaster process. It's a kind of answer to Schelling that we're participating in something that is physical, absolutely, and also more than that. It also stresses the relational, and this is an issue in integral I want to talk about. This relationality is really very secondary in integral, classic integral theory. The stress on the individual, the stress in the upper left quadrant, the stress in psychology, the stress on the lower left quadrant as a we, the idea of shifters of I, you, the just overall trajectory of it is not stressing relationality. And it may be that relationality is what human incarnation is really about. That we're not closed systems, we're open. And here I would turn to those therapeutic techniques that integrals does not talk about very often, but reach way, way down into the very emergence of our development. Pre-verbal theories like attachment theory, theories like the polyvagal theory, which relates to it, and methods like the internal family system. These three interrelated approaches are able to access pre-verbal patterns and are grounded in a sense that we're fundamentally relational. And any kind of secure individuation requires what's called in attachment theory secure attachment. And these things do not get fixed. No matter how evolved we get, no matter how much shadow work we do, they kind of underwrite, they fundamentally underwrite how we move. So in terms of shadow work, in terms of this core primary primitive, developmentally primitive and basic relationality that attachment theory teaches us and other theories teach us, is sort of a horizontal version of this primacy of thou relationality to these logoi in some sense. That would be a first piece. A second consequence is that I've alluded to is what Alice Bailey and the teacher Irving First call anti-glamour. Our spiritual worlds, despite what they say, are full of glamour, of how much I shine, how much you shine. It's not even narcissism, it's something more subtle. There's something about this merging, surrendering, communing with thou. And I think the Abrahamic traditions capture this sometimes with the sense of God as thou or Christ as thou. It has an ability to really cut through that residual narcissism, no matter how awake someone is, no matter how much they're not experiencing a self, no matter how much one is in an awakened location that's pure clear light and zero perspective. That personality still can operate with all kinds of patterning in the world. And this thou has the magic of actually cutting into the glamour, this tendency to glamour, this tendency to shine, intentionally, you might say, or to be important, or to, I got to be a teacher, or whatever it is. I've got the latest message. The messages are actually out there. These intelligences are actually reverberating with the, use a third person metaphor, the information. It's not really coming from a personality, you or me. So there's a profound sense of richness and aliveness of the universe, even within an awakened state of clear light. Everything is clear light, and there are thous. You know, it's both. It's not reducing the clear light to a mere nothingness if we're taking incarnation seriously. And so finally, I would say that this has to do with a real balancing of ascent and descent. You know, for those called to a path of really incarnating, this thou-ness is a way of making this world rich and meaningful. It's not magical in the sense of, you know, there are these beings out there and they pull strings, and it's not like that. There are laws or regularities or patterns to the physical world we live in that are distinctive, and these permeating logoi can condition, they can pressure, but they can't determine, you know, what happens in this particular plane. They interpenetrate it, but they can't determine it. So this is not escaping the physical world. It's not escaping social justice, but rather it's finding that it's situated, these important issues of our everyday lives are situated in much larger patterns, and in fact, in larger patterns of evolution that we may never have dreamed of. So let this be some quick reflections on the very opening of integral theory, the lessons from SES, both questioning and answering as a model, and then some of the results of my own inquiry and the inquiry of others of where this can lead us. And of course, it can lead us in many directions. And the point is that we're open now to talk about how we got there. So thank you. Thank you, Bruce. Thank you, everybody. It's been an honor to talk about this. Thank you.